Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I am Seth Berenzweig here in our studio in Tysons at BLC Digital Strategies in Tysons, Virginia. And we're here with our colleague and friend and nationally known author and columnist, John Tamny. John, how you doing today?
I'm great. Good to be here.
Fantastic. Well, big week here in the nation's capital, the midterm elections. A lot going on, not only from a standpoint of politics, but obviously from a standpoint of business, the market. Let's get right to it. Obviously, this is a work in progress, and as we speak, there is a lot of ambiguity going on, and I'll defer to you to kind of give the big picture description of what we know and what we don't know, and which is a lot on both sides. From what I can see as we sit here at the moment, the big red wave turned into perhaps a small red splash. The House will probably narrowly go red. The Senate may narrowly stay blue, with perhaps everything being drawn into a final election between Walker and Warnock in the first week of December, if things are flowing that way. So expectations really out the window. Bottom line for us, what do you see and what didn't you see? Where are we as we sit here talking about this major midterm election?
Well, when yesterday began, a colleague of mine at FreedomWorks came by the office, and it looked like Republicans, the expectation was they were going to take the House and Senate with relative ease and everything. Yep. He said, nothing's going to change. And I said, okay, that's a fair point, but never forget long-term freedom is winning relative to where things were in the 1970s. The freedom side is winning, if you want to call that Democrat or Republican. Let's never...
Freedom is winning, why?
Consider where we were. In the 1970s, if you wanted to make a phone call, it was on a landline that you plugged into a wall that you were not allowed to own. It was illegal. You rented it from the government's preferred monopoly. Mm-hmm. Air travel was centrally planned by the Civil Aeronautics Board. Okay. So it was very expensive. Only the rich got to do it. The top tax rate was 70% in the 1970s, and if you were for tax cuts, you were ridiculed by Republicans and Democrats. Okay. Nowadays, it's the price of admission in the GOP to talk about a tax cut if you want to win, and no Democrat with national ambitions ever talks about returning to the 1970s levels. And so freedom's winning. It takes time. And people focus on these elections so pointlessly, and they say, oh, well, this was awful. No. Progress is happening. It will happen.
So what happened? A lot of people expected a big red wave. The big red wave decidedly did not occur. What happened? Why did it happen? And is this something that the Republicans should feel dismayed and despondent about, or with a greater degree of patience could view this long term as a clear positive?
It's a great question. I think probably where to begin is that why did Republicans not do as well as they did? Mm-hmm. I'm of the view that they didn't because they've become ridiculous. And let's leave aside the Trump stuff that someone point to. Right. Republicans are now saying that inflation is caused by government spending. It's caused by deficits. They've never believed that in all of my lifetime, and they never have because it wasn't true. Right. And so they made higher prices that were so obviously born of lockdowns that their guy, Donald Trump, thought should have happened nationally. Right. They made it about Biden, and so they had no issues to run on. Right. It was Biden did all this. Biden is anti-oil.
He's the bad guy.
Yeah, and a barrel of oil is up 38%. Well, guess what? And it doesn't mean that I got it all right, but I kept saying, but it went up 400% under George W. Bush. Where were you all this time when all these disasters were happening on the Republican watch? And so I think to some degree they made it personal about some empty suit who can't remember this what he did yesterday, instead of making it about any issues related to economic growth.
Well, I agree that a lot of this, there's a lot of factors here. We have to discuss as many of them as we can. I agree with you that a lot of it was about the crazy. And just to be fair, there's plenty of crazy to go around on both sides of the aisle, okay? There's plenty of extremism and craziness to go around on both sides of the aisle. But although I agree with you that a lot of this was about the crazy, today's crazy is not your father's crazy. Today's crazy is they're eating babies. The Democrats are eating babies in the basement of a pizzeria in Northwest Washington, D.C. Today's crazies are about people going in and killing 5 individuals in the Capitol trying to have election denial and just a lot of things happening in terms of the shredding of democratic norms. And, it's really interesting. I saw Carrie Lake say this morning that she's denying the results of the election. That's not exactly a shocker. So crazy is in the eyes of the beholder, but it is also interesting to note that there are some conservative, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans that did well. Kemp in Georgia did well. He is a conservative Republican. He has not fallen behind Trump. Marco Rubio in Florida did well. He is very conservative, but he has not been one of the big trumpeters of Donald Trump. So, obviously there have been some catalysts that have come out there. And I think that the overturning of Roe versus Wade had some kind of an impact. How much of it, we'll never know. But do you think that there is some kind of a new guard that might be coming in for the Republicans? I sense a raising of the profile of DeSantis and a decreasing of the profile of Trump. And the reason I think it's important and interesting for us to talk about is because I think that that's also, as we'll talk about in a moment, going to be relevant from a business and from a markets standpoint, because you have 2 different people and they're going to have 2 different sets of policies. But do you see a changing of the guard here at all?
Yeah, and that's potentially a positive. There had been rumors yesterday that Donald Trump was going to announce his candidacy last night, and I think the assumption was rooted in, if there was a quote red wave, oh hey, look, I made this happen, and now I'm.
He would take credit.
Of course, he would take credit, and to be fair, that's good politics.
Yeah.
And so the plan, if this was true, to now I'm going to take back the country in 2 years. Let's continue the wave and all that.
Right.
After last night, let's be fair, he's no longer the kingmaker that he thought he was. And so it gives the Republicans a chance to move on. To me, as someone who historically always sided Republican, when I voted, I've generally voted Republican. I always was a Republican because I thought it was the party of ideas. I always thought I was always a Republican because I thought it was the party that most lifted up those with the least through policies of freedom. This Republican Party, I'm sorry, I don't recognize, and I say that while saying that Donald Trump in many ways had a successful presidency economically. And so here's a chance to move on from him. And you look at the Democrats, this is not necessarily going to help them. They
Why do you
need
say that?
divided government to do well. The best thing that ever happened to Bill Clinton was that he got it handed to him in 1994, and he was forced to move to the center. It got him a second term. Barack Obama had the same thing happen to him in 2010. It got him a second term. When you've got power, when the voters don't rebuke you, you continue to do what you were doing. And I don't think this helps Biden. I don't think it helps the Democrats, but it certainly doesn't help the Democrats because it gives Biden a reason to run again.
Well, certainly if the Democrats can hold on to the Senate, it's going to provide him, I think, some aspect of relief. If he's going to be fighting a somewhat unified Congress that's going to be red in both chambers, that's going to be a very marked difference. But I definitely take your point that that there was some progression for the Republicans last night. When we think about what happens to American business and the stock market, let's talk about that a little bit, because that's really the intersection of where we ultimately focus on here. and let me just also follow your point in terms of context to say that I am also a lifelong registered Republican who feels in political exile right now. The reason why I've been a lifelong Republican and my dad was a lifelong Republican was because I always viewed it to be pro-business, pro-freedom, and to allow people to be able to live their lives in a way where the government doesn't step in with a big foot and dictate. And while they were also strong on NATO and principles and ethics, unfortunately I think a lot of that has withered away. Although again, to be fair, there's plenty of issues and extremism on both sides of the aisle. As it relates to business, we know that there have been concerns with the administration as it relates to energy, as it relates to energy exploration, as it pertains to energy security. We have some issues going on with the availability of diesel in certain parts of the East Coast. There have been a lot of conflicting signals that have been coming out of the White House in that regard. From an American business standpoint, where do you see the results or the non-results of this election having an impact, if any, as it relates to corporate America?
Well, hopefully it has good results. Notice the markets aren't collapsing today,
True.
the day after, and there had been an expectation, I think, of a red wave. My sense is that the markets are basically saying there's going to be even more divided government from this. Not exactly, not a red wave, but not a blue wave. And so Biden certainly doesn't get a mandate out of this. He just wasn't embarrassed. The Republicans were embarrassed, but you could argue that the market's like that because it forces them to get real. I would just say about some of these bigger issues, it's so easily forgotten by the Republicans that under Ronald Reagan, the U.S. energy industry was largely non-existent. And that was true in the 80s and 90s, yet what was the price of a barrel during those 2 decades? Frequently it went below 10. Under George W. Bush, a barrel went all the way up to 150. And oil men, hey, wait a second, he loves fossil fuel. At some point, Republicans are going to have to be forced to get real and go back to first principles that Ronald Reagan ran on a strong, stable dollar. He ran gasp on returning to some kind of commodity standard for money. If you want cheap commodities, you must have good money. We have not had it since George W. Bush. He reversed the policies of Reagan and Clinton in disastrous fashion. As a lifelong Republican, I would say George W. Bush was easily the worst president in my lifetime, and no one else comes close. But until we get back to this, all this talk about energy independence, and oh, please, we were so dependent on the world under Reagan and Clinton, and we were buying gas for under $1 a gallon.
True, although we live in a very different world right now, and when it comes to energy independence, Western Europe's singing a different tune right now.
Are they?
Yeah, well, it can be debated. It's a very different world now than it was then, and and the role of Xi and Putin are going to have certain implications. But I'm with you that I long for a lot of the aspects of the days of Reaganism. So I'm with you there. I'd like to pick up on a phrase that you use that I think I'm just going to grab onto as the phrase of the day for Republicans, which is to get real, and I think that is an important takeaway from this election, which is still, frankly, very much in flux, because in order for us to have the rule of law, we have to have leadership that respects institutions, that respects ballots, that respects votes, and that respects the Constitution. I was having a conversation with a very smart friend of mine the other day, and I asked him the question, if there's going to be a process with the Republican Party where the Constitution is shred up in tatters, where is the rule of law? And he said, well, ultimately, you may just end up with state militias. That's really scary. It is indefensible and it is inexcusable for the Republicans to not take back the power and bring back some level of predictability and solidarity and wisdom to bringing back the center right to allow the predictability of American business to move forward. A lot of the Republicans are hearing the president's jawboning of energy companies and giving them a hard time and trying to tell them that they're going to be punished for doing business the way that they are. I think that there are a lot of shortcomings in that, but how can we think that the market and American business is going to be secure for the next 2 years, for the next 20 years, if we have a situation where Republicans are going to come in like Donald Trump and Kerry Lake and say, I'm either going to win or I'm going to win. And we know full well that there's systemic risk, that there could be another insurrection. And I don't think that that's going to be good for American business. I don't think that's going to be good for American security. I don't think that's going to be good for the American stock market. It's really interesting to even see the implications in terms of international security and national security as it relates to international relations. 70% of voters last night who were polled said that they support the continued maintenance of the level of support that America is providing to Ukraine. Only 3 out of 10 want to go the McCarthy road and draw that into question. So I think that hopefully the Republicans are listening to you, because I don't know what the hell's going on out there, but I think that both parties need to consider getting back to their roots, because if we end up in political extremism, isn't that really just going to be potentially a disaster? I know that sometimes you and I downplay the relevance of all these clueless bureaucrats in Washington, but can't they do a lot of damage if we just end up going back into infighting and extremism?
Yeah, or you could argue that the extremism means that very little is done, and so there's a positive to that. Let's acknowledge that Republicans watching right now are saying, hey, wait a second, we're not the only deniers. And you look back to after Trump was elected, I'm not talking about Daily Kos. I'm talking about the New Yorker was printing articles, very establishment publications, saying that the Russians with a $100,000 buy on Facebook swung the elections. And so crazy as you've acknowledged is both sides. And so where I'm going with this is Republicans will say, well, they did it too. And what I always say to them, if the Democrats are your standard for how you're going to act, shame on you, because you embarrass all of us. At some point, Republicans have to say that we're not going to be election deniers, because that's what losers do. And that's what the Democrats have always done. And they've always fought election results. Nixon, when he lost to Kennedy, even though he knew he'd won, thought it was bad for the country to do it. There is something to being above it all and saying, you know what? The president really doesn't matter that much as is, because we believe in constitutional governance. And if we do our job in keeping power in the states, this won't matter. So no more of this will they deny. How about acting like Republicans, and in so doing, not acting crazy?
I'll do even one better than that. You talk about how the power of the office of the president, from a constitutional standpoint, shouldn't even really be all that all-powerful. If you take a look at the Constitution, and if you look at the enumerated powers underneath it, the enumerated powers for Congress are very, very long. The enumerated scope of powers for the office of the executive branch is actually very, very short. So if you look at the text, you would think that the office of the presidency should really just do in the executive branch to execute the laws. But to your point, that power balance has really gotten distorted over the years. So to bring this in for a conclusion, let's try to think about the following question. Regardless of party and regardless of reason, who do you believe would be a good person anywhere in the United States, be it either inside or outside the Beltway, that from a standpoint of reason, logic, business, and the stock market would be someone that you would really like to see their profile elevated to some kind of a leadership role, not necessarily to try to grab the ring for presidency, but some kind of a higher level leadership role to bring us back to some kind of stability and sanity here in Washington?
There was the former governor of Kentucky who lost, and I always liked him. He seemed less political. My honest answer is I want to find out the most womanizing golf-playing person of all and get that person to office. I mean, I'm always reminded that Arthur Laffer voted for Bill Clinton twice. And he did because he thought this guy's going to be distracted while in office.
So that he doesn't cause too much damage?
There's always this view. Republicans always get excited about, oh, a businessman's running. A businessman will know how to run the country.
Yeah.
This is not a business. This is, as you allude, a federal government that at least via the Constitution has very few powers. At some point, we don't need an effective person in the White House. We need a responsible person who's read the Constitution.
Yes, amen. I think that we don't need to have a CEO in the White House. We need someone who acts like an executive CEO in the White House. We don't need an Elon Musk or a Donald Trump in the White House. We need someone who can actually run the government like a business. And although I'm very doubtful that he will run for president, I wish that we could see more of a pronounced role by someone like Mitt Romney, who is moderate. He has a lot of detractors, but at least he was someone who understood corporate America. He understood the markets. He was moderate. He was right on a number of different things, and unfortunately, obviously, he didn't win the day. But I think I'd like to see him take a little bit more of a prominent role. John, as we see the coming days and weeks unfold, we may not get an answer on this until next month, but undoubtedly, we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll keep the analysis going. Thanks so much for coming in today.